I think it's fair to say that this last year hasn't exactly gone to plan. And as I was reflecting upon that, I used Statera to model what the last year might have looked like in terms of the fitness and how the restrictions and lockdowns and implications of things like year group bubbling on the physical activity of the youth athlete population may have had. And I wanted to share that with you so you can see how the planning scheduling tool and the use of default values can be used to make more informed decisions essentially for programming. So if I just dive in, I created a year of events that replicated what the pupils will have experienced in terms of structured provision offered to them across the last year from the lockdown in March. And I just wanted to share it with you. So I created a player and a team that would have experienced that retrospectively. As you can see here, I've got Matt Hancock, a bit tongue-in-cheek. He's our player. And if we look at this player page, we can see his profile details, and these are the events he's been a member of. He's a member of a team called Boris and Gav's COVID-11. And if we look at that team, we can see the commitments that this team has. It's probably easier to look and examine these from the sheet that I uploaded to create these events to explain the assumptions behind what the model will essentially look like. But if you look at these first sort of 6 lines here, this is what the spring term should have looked like, or did look like until the 23rd of March. We had Monday games and Wednesday game sessions, a PE session once a week, a couple of S&C sessions, and a fixture on the Saturday at the weekend. Again, of course, these are entirely customizable to what day of the week they are, start and end time, and of course the RPE. You get an option to put in the RPE, which will be the default value for the session, unless, of course, you override that with a coach input or an athlete input for what they experience to be. And, of course, this could be any measure as well. It doesn't have to be RPE. It could be weight lifted, distance run. But this is the sort of way in which you start to set up a training stress score for these sessions, or an estimate of that. So the normal sort of spring term, of course, we went into lockdown on the 23rd of March. And throughout the summer term, it's probably a generous assumption to say that these kids may well have been doing 3 structured sessions a week, just half hour here and there, 45 minutes. Of course, some may have done more or less, but again, I've made a rough assumption and estimate that the RPE might have been 3 or 4 out of 10 for those sessions. It doesn't really matter. It's just to give us a rough guesstimate of what that might have looked like. We went into the summer holidays, so less structure. No remote sessions online through Teams or Zoom or whatever it might have been, and just unstructured training for them. There wasn't much in the way of provision through youth or community sport, so I've given them a fairly light estimate of a couple of, 1 half hour, 1 45-minute session a week. Again, may have been more or less than that. As we came back in the autumn term, you can see here back to Monday and Wednesday games looked slightly different, but then we also had PE sessions coming back in once a week, and maybe even a strength and conditioning session, which we reintroduced in the second half of the autumn term. We were then plunged back into lockdown, so that looks very similar to the summer lockdown. In fairness, it's probably a little bit better than this. I reckon there's probably a little bit more structure and consistency in this spring term, the second lockdown, than we had over the original summer term. And then this is potentially what the training might look like when we go back on the 8th of March. So back to Monday and Wednesday games, a PE session once a week, and perhaps a strength and conditioning session. Obviously no fixtures at the weekend just yet in the fixture calendar. So if we jump back into the app and see what that might have looked like over the first sort of 3 months in this graph here, this is actually representative of the first half of the spring term for events I've added. Second half of the spring term, obviously you see this decrease in acute training load and chronic training load over the half-term period, and then the end of the spring term, and then into the summer term. But if we want to look at a bit more of a zoom-out view, you can see, of course, here the calendar for that team. But if we go to the charting page, we can dial down onto Matt Hancock's training stress balance graph. So we can select any measure we want here, anything we might have recorded, but I'm going to look obviously at the session RPE and the training stress score that created. I can choose how to aggregate the data for these recordings. Of course, there's only one data point per day, and how you want to interpolate that, I'm just going to use no interpolation method here, because I'm going to choose a training stress balance graph. which will obviously use exponentially weighted moving averages to calculate the sort of drop in fatigue and fitness on the chart. Now, this is what happened last year, but I've plotted this forward in time. So this is what, if we had perfect future vision, we could have foreseen all of this about to happen. But I plotted this through to April next year. So that's what we should have data for. So I put the end of April next year. And if I click add to that graph, that will now create a training stress balance graph for Matt Hancock's RP based on that. So here we go. This is obviously the spring term, the first half of the spring term, second half of the spring term into lockdown. Again, ignoring the ACWR, the acute chronic workload ratio initially, because there is obviously no chronic workload inputted into the data set before that point. That will start to make a little bit more sense in giving us an understanding of the relative amount of work that athlete is potentially doing compared to their sort of 28 8-day average, for example, once we've moved a little bit further into the data set. So as you can see here, over the first summer term, those 3 light structured sessions a week actually probably would have represented a little bit of a drop in fitness overall, or chronic training load for most athletes. And obviously this starts to level off and filter out once we get to that second half of that summer term. And that probably was also reflected in a lack of uptake. I think most coaches and PE teachers experienced a bit of lockdown fatigue, and it was difficult to kind of keep the athletes motivated as we moved into the summer holidays. Again, much less structure in the summer holidays, not a lot of opportunities or structured opportunities for fitness and physical activity. Then, of course, we come back into the autumn term where we had those couple of PE lesson a week and a couple of game sessions a week. We didn't actually introduce strength and conditioning until the second half, formally, of the second half of the autumn term. So it represented a build in fitness, but as you can see here, even a modest and lighter schedule than we'd normally have in the autumn term represents quite a big jump in acute to chronic workload ratio, which could potentially present some problems. Autumn half term, obviously kids go back and don't do a great deal a lot of the time, certainly not with the amount of sport available currently. And then build back that fitness over the second half of the autumn term. Again, a little bit more structured. There's an extra session in here, so there's maybe a bit of S&C here as well. So that will probably represent a build in fitness. Now, fortunately, we got to the Christmas holidays and we'll plunge back into lockdown, but we knew a little bit more this time around and probably a little bit quicker to re-implement some Zoom or virtual learning and virtual fitness options. But even taking that into account, once we reach the end of this half of term, and we're potentially coming back a couple of weeks after half term on March the 8th, you can see here that again will represent, even from a lighter schedule, quite a jump in acute to chronic workload ratio. So something we might want to consider in terms of how we begin to reintroduce it. And of course, then we have another 3 weeks off once we've reached the end of this term. So this is just a look back on what might have happened, but hopefully you can see how you would use this functionality in Statera to perhaps plot out a season, list of fixtures. Different athletes will have different training commitments at different times of year. They might be members of a couple of teams, have extracurricular commitments outside of school as well, and these will all play into what their fitness and fatigue might look like across a year. And again, this is just a model, of course. It's not really super predictive, but at least gives us a good understanding of everything on the same page to be able to make a bit more of an informed decision. So that's really what I wanted to show you through. I hope you like it. And of course, if you have any comments or questions, drop us a line through our website on the contacts page or get in touch with us on any of our social media channels. Thanks very much.